July 2nd, 1944. The kind of date that cleaves a life into before and after. She steps from blackness into a white so sharp it hurts. For days, the cave hospital near Cherbourg had been nothing but lamplight and the smell of carbolic, sweat and old blood. Now, as Dr. Schwester raises her hands, palms open in the universal posture of surrender, the sun feels obscene on the backs of her fingers. Behind her, 8 nurses file out in a narrow column, each blinking at the world they haven't truly seen since the siege began. A strip of sky, a slope of chalky earth, American uniforms arranged with method that looks, she hates the word, calm. Hours earlier, deep underground, she'd shaken her head at rumours traded like contraband between the cots. American hospitals with electric light in every theatre, refrigerated medicines, a warehouse of bandages used once and thrown away. Propaganda, she'd told the others, the syllables clipped to steady them and herself. Meant to break us. It had worked for months. You steady your world by insisting it can't be otherwise. A sergeant with a soft Carolina accent takes their names carefully, letter by letter, as if the spelling matters. It does, in medicine and in war. A bilingual medic checks their wrists for pulse and shock, while another offers water that doesn't taste of rust. Every movement is practiced, almost rehearsed, and the order of it pricks her pride. Order is supposed to be theirs. They're led toward tents marked with red crosses, tall, clean canvas, not the patched quilts of their cave. The sign reads, 45th Evacuation Hospital. A colonel stands under an awning, cap tilted, light catching the eagles on his shoulders. He is studying them the way a diagnostician studies a chart, not hostile, not friendly, simply alert. When he steps forward and introduces himself as Colonel Richard P. Johnson, the words are neutral and exact. You, enemy nurses, he says, and fellow medical professionals, you'll be processed under the Geneva Convention and returned in exchange shortly. The sentence lands like an impossible promise. Returned? So swiftly? The war has taught them to expect delay as a policy. They're separated by roll for the first examination. It's perfunctory in the way that only deep competence can afford to be. Temperature, blood pressure, auscultation, skin check for infection, lice inspection done without contempt. A field sterilizer hisses. A glass thermometer emerges from alcohol, not boiled water gone brown from repetition. Someone charts her findings in pencil on a clipboard whose edges aren't frayed. The nurse's script is clear, the kind they taught back in school, straight baselines, rounded loops, before the war turned hand into claw. Then there's the pharmacy tent. It feels like stepping into a textbook turned real. Rows of labelled bottles in a temperature that never wavers. Ampules arranged by dose and date, drawers that slide without sticking. She recognizes sulfur at a glance, sulfadiazine, sulfathiazole, but not the quantity. In the cave, sulfur was a ritual, tapped out like a sacrament, each grain argued over. Here it's measured, documented, dispensed with a confidence that is not waste but certainty. A young corporal, American, freckles, a little bored, logs each item, eyes flicking between vial and ledger. And she realizes with a jolt that boredom in a pharmacy is a luxury that comes from never having to beg. Penicillin? One of her colleagues whispers in German, a word more rumour than drug. The American pharmacist hears the tone, if not the sentence. He holds up a tray as if it's a loaf pulled fresh from an oven. Penicillin, yes, multiple lots, cold chain intact. Cold chain, she turns the phrase over. Here it means the difference between miracle and mould. They pass an operating tent, flaps tied back for airflow. Inside, a surgical team stands around a young infantryman whose leg looks, she inventories automatically, salvageable with debridement and antibiotics. Overhead, a pair of adjustable surgical lamps throw a white, steady light that never flickers. There's an electric suction line, and it hums. Electric suction. She remembers the cave's hand pump, the way her forearm burned after 20 minutes of pulling and pausing while the surgeon cursed the clots he couldn't clear fast enough. Here, the surgeon says, suction, and it happens. No drama, no sermon, just physics and planning. Worse than the light and the suction is the way the team speaks to one another. The scrub nurse suggests a change in suture choice. The surgeon doesn't snap, he considers. Good point. Let's switch to 3-0 for the fascia. The anaesthetist announces vitals in a cadence that never strains, and the circulating nurse notes them without being asked. Authority moves like current through wire, visible in what it powers, not the way it shocks. An enlisted man appears with a tray for the newly captured nurses, coffee in paper cups, bread, even a square of chocolate. It's outrageous, laughable, until a hunger she's kept at bay for days knocks at the back of her teeth. She takes the cup with hands that want to shake but don't. Across the yard, a jeep rattles by with boxes stenciled plasma. She watches the boxes the way a farmer watches rain. Colonel Johnson returns with papers for each of them. Identification, temporary status, instructions. His tone is clipped but not cold. You'll get a demonstration this afternoon. Our protocols. Your medical personnel. You should see how we work. It strikes her as arrogance. No, as pedagogy. In her world, you conceal processes from enemies as if secrecy itself heals wounds. In his, the demonstration is a statement of faith. Skills grow by being used, not hoarded. The demonstration turns out to be a trauma drill with a real casualty at its center. A private with a penetrating abdominal wound from shell fragments, stabilized by a forward surgical team and evacuated here for definitive care. She catches herself evaluating automatically. Tachycardic but perfusing, pale but responsive, a belly that will tell hard truths when opened. The anaesthetist checks blood type, and then something strange happens. No direct transfusion. No desperate donor lined up on a neighboring cot. Instead, the nurse wheels in a metal canister. Tubing snakes neatly from a glass bottle labelled plasma with typed, not scribbled data. The flow begins with a measured certainty that makes her throat tight. They have plasma in stock. They have it ready. She fights an old reflex to scoff, to label it showmanship. But the vitals don't care about ideology. The numbers improve. When the operation starts, the American surgeon narrates for the benefit of the observers, Americans and Germans alike. We open midline, expose fully, suction, there you are. Control the bleeding, please. Pack, good. Visceral injuries, here, resection and anastomosis. His hands move with a steadiness that looks like arrogance until you realize it's competence written on the body. The scrub nurse anticipates instruments by the shape of his shoulder before he asks. They've done this together 100 times, which is not a boast, but an indictment of war. After, outside the tent, she hears the German replies around her. They must be hoarding. It can't last. Propaganda. But the private will live, and propaganda does not lower a fever. They are shown the sterilization line next, autoclaves that hiss and click and measure. The American trainer, Captain Helen Morrison, explains the validation strips that change color to prove temperature achieved. Prove. Yet in the cave, proof was the surgeon's temper. If he didn't throw the instruments, they were sterile enough. Here, a strip of paper speaks with authority more final than rank. Captain Morrison looks directly at them as she talks, neither pandering nor pressing. Your scope matters, she says. You're responsible for patient outcomes. If something's wrong, speak up, even if the person you're speaking to outranks you. The sentence is the most seditious thing Schwester has heard in a military camp. It's also the sanest. By late afternoon, the rhythm of the place has seeped into her bones enough that she can taste what it's made of. Logistics. Not luck, not propaganda, not a single miracle drug. Logistics. That is the true lamp in the operating tent. A refrigerated truck chuffs in behind the pharmacy. The quartermaster signs for crates, needles, tubing, ligatures, each stamped with dates and batch numbers. A clerk files the paperwork with a patience that can only exist when you are not counting the last 3 vials of anything. A medic from Tennessee shows her the blood typing station. He does it as if he's showing off a motorcycle to a friend. There is joy in his voice when he talks about the process, reagents, cross-matching, the shock of a transfusion reaction not happening because they refused to gamble. He's proud, not of killing, not of flags, but of the science that makes survival ordinary. That night, the Americans assign the German nurses cots in a tent downwind of the latrines, consideration with a line drawn through it. They're prisoners and nurses, both true at once. A Red Cross worker appears with a box of small personal items, soap that smells faintly of flowers, a cheap comb, stationery. The worker offers each item like the final stitch in a wound. Schwester's hands find the bar of soap. She wants to cry at a scent. She doesn't sleep. The canvas moves with every draft like a thoughtful animal, and each time it does, she sees the day in slices, the bright mouth of the operating tent, the penicillin tray, the colonel's even tone, the suction tube. Images that stand in for larger truths she doesn't want to name because names make things sticky in the mind. Before dawn, voices wake the tent. A runner is shouting for a team, new ambulances incoming, multiple casualties. The Americans move from asleep to ready with a fluidity that startles her. Boots, belts, a single gulp of coffee, and they are at stations. She finds herself standing in the flap's shadow, hair tied back, hands at her sides, foolishly waiting for someone to order her away. No one does. No one invites her either. She is not part of this machine, but she knows how to move in a hospital, anywhere. The first ambulance backs in, brakes sighing. They wheel out a young man with a chest wound. A nurse calls for a setup. The instrument table blooms with steel in seconds. The second casualty has a mangled hand. "We can save it," the surgeon says. No drama, just decision. The third is bad. Grey, wet breaths, a belly tight as a drum. The triage nurse does not flinch, does not wave her hands, does not raise her voice. She changes nothing but where the gurney goes, and in that small choreography she alters a life's arc. Schwester feels the old electricity rise in her own body, the thing that drew her to medicine before anyone told her what medicine was for. It is the sensation of purpose unhooked from politics. Later, when the rush recedes and the sun has cleared the tops of the tents, Captain Morrison walks over and hands her a small notebook and a stub of pencil. "Write what you saw," the captain says. "Not what you were told would be here. What you saw." The request feels dangerous. It's also an order she understands down to the heel of her hand. She writes, "Light that doesn't fail, suction that doesn't tire, plasma without a donor in the next cot, antibiotics that arrive cold, not warm and dead." A nurse who could say, "I disagree," and be heard. She stops, rests the tip of the pencil against the page until it leaves a dot darker than punctuation. Then she writes the sentence she would have mocked yesterday. If this is propaganda, it saves lives. At noon, Colonel Johnson calls them to a shaded spot and explains their status again. Processed today, transferred within days for exchange. 16 in total across 2 dates, he notes, as if exactness itself is merciful. The numbers slip into her like thread. One of her colleagues, Greta, with the habit of watching like a scholar, asks to see the X-ray unit. The Americans oblige without hesitation. Inside a truck body converted into a radiology bay, the radiographer shows them plates and positioning, the way to shield and the way to read. Schwester stares at a rib cage rendered in shadows and rooms of air. In the cave, diagnosis was a hand and a prayer. Here, bone confesses. That afternoon, a chaplain passes by with a crate of paper-wrapped parcels from the Red Cross. He leaves some on their table with a nod, and she unwraps one to find a bar of chocolate she can smell through the foil. When you have lived on ration bread and black coffee, sweetness is not a flavor, it is a moral argument. She breaks the chocolate into squares and shares it without ceremony. The women eat in silence, not because they don't have words, but because they have too many. In the distance, a truck marked Medical College Idols, waiting for orders. She asks what it is and is told casually that American medical schools send lecturers and material to forward hospitals when schedules allow, as if a university were a neighbor who drops by with a casserole, as if knowledge were predictable as mail. By evening, the day has become a system in her head. Intake, evaluation, intervention, documentation, restock, repeat. The arrows do not kink. The arrows do not depend on a single glorious improvisate. Ion. The arrows are the point. She walks once more past the operating tent. Inside, the surgeon leans his hip against the table, talking easily with the scrub nurse about a new suture technique he read about before he shipped. The calm is not indifference. It is earned. At the edge of the camp, the sky cuts open into colours that would feel sentimental if not for the smell of phenol and diesel keeping everything honest. She stands there long enough that the cool creeps through her coat and into her bones, long enough to feel the cave recede a step and the present advance one. Tomorrow they will be sent rearward to a processing point, counted, swapped for American personnel, and sent back across a line that moves like a tide. She will return to her army, to its rhetoric and punishments, to its shrivelling stores and its barking certainty. She will do her duty. But tonight, just for tonight, she admits a private diagnosis. The daylight did not just reveal a camp, it revealed a hypothesis proven. And once you have seen proof under a lamp that does not flicker, the darkness cannot make you unknow it. The journey backward from Cherbourg's blinding daylight leads inevitably to a furnace of heat 1 year earlier, where belief began to fray not with lamps and suction tubes, but with sunburn and sand. May 13th, 1943. Tunisia. The desert had always been merciless, but on that day it was final. The Axis lines that had once seemed like extensions of an empire were instead crowded pockets of exhaustion, dwindling supplies, and hopeless manoeuvres. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim signed the surrender, and with his ink stroke the desert ceased to be a battlefield and became a processing ground. Nearly 250,000 men, soldiers, orderlies, doctors and nurses, laid down their arms or their instruments. The dust in the air did not settle, but the war in North Africa did. For the nurses of the DRK, the Deutsches Rotes Kreuz, German Red Cross, capture was not a distant rumour. It was immediate, unavoidable. They had dressed wounds in tents that buckled with heat, stitched by candle stub when kerosene ran dry, and prayed over bandages boiled so often that they shredded mid-wrap. Yet surrender did not bring the humiliation of jeering enemies. It brought something stranger. A methodical sorting line run by Americans who did not look triumphant so much as prepared. At collection points in Tunis, tables were arranged with typewriters, scales, and blood pressure cuffs. American medical officers moved down the line, separating combat troops from medical personnel with a precision that felt surgical. Within hours, lists were compiled, charts filled, and orders issued. German doctors and nurses who had expected to rot in uncertainty found themselves told where they would go next, what they would do, and even when. Among the captured was Schwester Ilse Schultz, already decorated with the Iron Cross Second Class in April 1943, one of fewer than 20 German women to receive such distinction in the entire war. Her colleague, Schwester Greta Volk, bore the same medal. And where Ilse carried herself with the stiff spine of recognition, Greta carried a notebook. She documented always symptoms, rations, conversations. In that notebook, she wrote words that would later resurface in archives. The Americans throw away more in a day than we see in a month. They have medicines we have only heard about. It began with the medical examination. Every captured nurse, even prisoners, was given a physical using instruments that had become rare treasures in the Afrika Korps. Thermometers that weren't chipped glass, stethoscopes that still held their tubing supple instead of cracked by heat, a scale that was not a guess. More than once, German nurses stared at the cuff of a sphygmomanometer tightening on their arm, blood pressure read in numbers, not in guesswork from a pulse against the wrist. The psychological tremors multiplied aboard the ships that carried them away. Liberty ships, mass-produced, slab-sided, unsentimental. To German eyes, they should have been crude, like the makeshift hospital caves of Tunisia, functional, ugly, and cheap. Instead, they discovered that these ships embodied a paradox, built in weeks, yet carrying medical facilities more advanced than many German civilian hospitals. On board, the nurses saw operating rooms where electric light did not fail, where X-ray machines hummed steadily, and where refrigeration kept medicines cold, not spoiled. The scale was as shocking as the technology. Bandages, once boiled and reboiled until they fell apart, were discarded after a single use. Sulfur powder, rationed by the pinch in the desert, was dusted liberally into wounds so freely that it coated the air. The waste was what shocked them most. German personnel, gaunt from rations measured in ounces, watched American medics scrape uneaten food into bins. They flinks, hid at what felt like blasphemy, discarded bread, vegetables half-touched, meat left cold. The American crew treated it as routine. Waste for them was not failure. It was the byproduct of surplus, the kind of abundance that made hoarding unnecessary. For the German nurses indoctrinated with the belief that America was weak, decadent, and collapsing under depression, the evidence was merciless. On the Liberty ships, weakness meant a man setting aside a sandwich he could not finish. Decadence meant a hospital lamp that burned without sputtering. During the voyage, the psychological fissures widened. In German hospitals, blood transfusion often meant a donor laid on a cot beside the patient, tubing spliced directly vein to vein. The procedure was desperate, risky, sometimes fatal. On the Liberty ship, a young medic with a clean uniform and clipped accent wheeled in bottles labelled plasma, each with typed labels, expiration dates, and batch numbers. He connected tubing with a calm that bordered on casual, and the wounded received life not from a fellow soldier's sacrifice, but from a system that had planned for them before they were even injured. It was, in the truest sense, industrialized compassion. When the ships docked, at Norfolk, at New York, at ports that loomed with cranes and warehouses, the German personnel expected jeering crowds or suspicion. Instead, they were processed again, swiftly, medically. Infections were treated, dental work was performed, even corrective lenses were issued. To be given glasses in captivity, lenses that German civilians could not obtain at home, was disorienting enough to make one question everything. The train journeys inland deepened the cracks. Through the windows they glimpsed hospitals rising like cathedrals, lit even at night, their silhouettes dominating cities from Richmond to Philadelphia. They had believed propaganda that painted America as a land of soup lines and boarded windows. Yet every urban center they passed glowed with steel, brick, and neon. At Washington, D.C., Red Cross volunteers boarded their train, not to interrogate, not to sneer, but to hand out packages. Cigarettes, soap, chocolate, writing paper. The irony was sharper than any insult. Enemies were receiving gifts from civilians while their own army rationed truth and kindness alike. Arrival at camps like Opelika, Alabama, made the cracks unhideable. The hospital there became a school without declaring itself one. German nurses, accustomed to Nazi racial medicine, where patients were ranked by ideological worth, found themselves ordered into wards where Americans supervised but allowed them to practice. They treated their own wounded under Geneva rules, but side by side with Americans who practiced medicine as though healing was its own nationality. For the first time, German nurses saw African American professionals in uniform. The Nazi state had drilled into them that black individuals were primitive, incapable of higher skill. Yet here they stood, trained, competent, supervising. The shock was deeper than penicillin, deeper than surplus. It struck at the root of an ideology that had framed their identity. If this propaganda was false, what else had been false all along? By July 21, 1944, when Glennan General Hospital in Oklahoma became POW General Hospital No. 1, the cracks had become fractures. Integrated teams, German and American, worked together because the work itself demanded it. Instruments sterilized in autoclaves that finished in minutes, not hours. Surgical lights that adjusted by lever, not by balancing a lantern on a stool. Autonomy granted to nurses who could contradict a doctor if patient safety required it. These details were not accidents of luxury. They were the proof of a system that built abundance not by conquest but by production. America manufactured medicine as it manufactured ships, and the effect was overwhelming. Greta Falk's notes from the period, later, recovered, show the psychological toll of the revelations. They treat us as professionals, even as enemies. Their colored nurses practice medicine with greater knowledge than many of our own. Their hospitals have more medicine than Berlin. They waste, and yet it is not waste. It is power. The final crack came with penicillin. German medicine had no answer to sepsis. A wound that festered was a death sentence, and amputations were as common as bandaging. In American hospitals, penicillin was administered as casually as aspirin, infections cleared in days, and amputations became rare. German nurses who had signed papers condemning patients to death now watched men rise from fevers that should have killed them. It was not just medicine, it was philosophy. They had been trained in a system where medicine served the Reich, where the weak were expendable, and where ideology trumped compassion. In American captivity, they saw the opposite. Medicine served the patient, regardless of nationality. Healing was not propaganda, it was policy. By the time these nurses returned to Germany after 1945, they carried more than medical skills. They carried an unshakable diagnosis. Their system had lied, and the lie had cost lives. America had shown them that strength was not shouting about superiority. Strength was sterilizing, refrigerating, documenting, and sharing. The desert surrender had begun their captivity. The liberty ships had begun their education. And the first ideological cracks had begun to open not under interrogation, but under fluorescent lamps and humming autoclaves. The women who had left Tunisia, believing they served the most advanced nation on earth, now looked back and realized their true transformation had started on decks that smelled of salt and antiseptic, where wastebaskets overflowed not with propaganda but with bandages too clean to bother reusing. When the trains rolled inland from the Atlantic ports, German medical personnel thought the strangeness of liberty ships and Red Cross parcels had reached its limit. They were wrong. What awaited them was not simply captivity. It was immersion into a system so alien to Nazi medical doctrine that it shook their identities from the inside out. The first stop for many was Camp Opelika, Alabama. At first glance, it was rows of wooden barracks surrounded by wire, sentries in khaki, and the familiar aura of confinement. But at the heart of the camp stood a hospital. It was here that the captured German nurses encountered a reality that neither propaganda nor medical training had prepared them for. Enemy and caregiver coexisting under one roof, not as spies or rivals, but as professionals divided only by language. American officers followed the Geneva Convention with precision. Captured German medical staff were not sidelined. They were retained to treat their own wounded. But the supervision and infrastructure were American. That supervision quickly became instruction, and that infrastructure became a living demonstration. The German nurses stepped into operating rooms that gleamed like altars to a different faith. Surgical lamps suspended from articulated arms cast bright circles that didn't flicker. Autoclaves hissed steam through trays of instruments, sterilizing in minutes instead of the hours-long boiling sessions they were used to. There were suction machines that ran on electricity, not fatigued muscles. Pharmacies stocked with rows of bottles in climate-controlled cabinets held medications with expiration dates years into the future. The immediate shock was not only technological, it was professional. In Nazi Germany, nursing was an extension of hierarchy. Orders came down from the physician. The nurse obeyed without hesitation. In America, they witnessed something different. Nurses with autonomy. Nurses who questioned a doctor's order if it endangered a patient. Nurses who were expected to chart observations, propose alternatives, and exercise judgment. At first, the German prisoners dismissed it as chaos disguised as freedom. But as they watched outcomes, patients stabilized, limbs saved, infections cleared, they recognized a discipline of its own. Authority here was not blind obedience, it was accountability rooted in patient survival. One American officer, Captain Helen Morrison, crystallized the difference when she addressed a group of German Red Cross nurses. "You're responsible for outcomes," she said simply. "If something's wrong, speak up. Rank doesn't matter when a patient is bleeding out." The line landed like blasphemy against every page of their training manuals, yet the evidence was in the living bodies around them. Orders unquestioned in German hospitals often led to amputations or deaths. Orders questioned here led to recoveries. The ideological conflict grew sharper when they encountered African American nurses. In the Reich's worldview, racial hierarchy was as immutable as gravity. Yet in American POW hospitals, black professionals supervised German staff. At Camp Florence, Arizona, Lieutenant Eleanor Powell, an African American nurse, instructed German nurses on wound care protocols. Her voice was steady, her technique flawless, her authority unquestionable within the American system. The German women obeyed, at first with clenched jaws, later with open notebooks. Every correction Powell gave, every time she adjusted a bandage, demonstrated sterile technique, or recalibrated a transfusion, was a direct contradiction of the racial myths they had memorized. The irony was impossible to miss. The U.S. Army itself practiced segregation, relegating black nurses to POW wards instead of allowing them to treat white American soldiers. And yet, even in this compromised structure, the professionalism of African American nurses dismantled German indoctrination, one patient at a time. Schwester Greta Falk's notebook captured the moment. "She knows more than any of us. We were taught to see inferiority. Instead, we are being taught by it." The clash between ideology and evidence reached its peak with penicillin. At Camp Forest, Tennessee, German nurses saw infections that would have meant certain death in their own hospitals disappear within days. Wounds that would have ended in amputation healed with limbs intact. Soldiers who would have been written off walked again. It was not simply a drug, it was a revelation. Penicillin represented a line that divided the old world from the new. On one side, superstition disguised as doctrine. On the other, science producing results visible to the eye. For nurses trained in racial medicine, where weakness was purged, not healed, the existence of a drug that saved lives regardless of ideology or origin was an unbearable contradiction. The Americans did not hoard this miracle as a weapon. They demonstrated it openly, explained it clinically, and administered it to German patients as readily as to American ones. The message was unmistakable. Medicine was not a tool of ideology here. It was a universal obligation. The German nurses found themselves documenting what they learned with compulsive care. Burn treatments developed from Pacific campaigns, surgical innovations tested on European battlefields, blood plasma systems that used cross-matching and refrigeration instead of desperate donor-to-patient transfers. Even water purification and epidemic control methods were taught to them in courses arranged within the camps. By 1944, the Special Projects Division expanded this informal education into structured programs. German medical staff attended lectures at institutions like the University of Nebraska Medical School at Fort Robinson. The subjects were as shocking as the techniques. medical ethics, patient rights, and the scientific method as applied to clinical practice. The method of teaching itself, encouraging questions, debate, and disagreement, was anathema to the rigid hierarchy of Nazi Germany. The contradictions multiplied. German nurses, who had been drilled to view medicine as a racial tool, were shown medical texts authored by Jewish scientists, researchers expelled or murdered under the very regime they had served. To see their names cited with respect, their discoveries taught as foundations of practice, produced a dissonance deeper than any operating lamp could cast. Meanwhile, American hospitals like Glennan General in Oklahoma and Ravenel in France pushed the collaboration further. Integrated teams of American and German staff treated prisoners and Allied soldiers side by side. In one ward, a German nurse adjusted a drip line while an American nurse checked vitals. In another, a black American nurse demonstrated how to monitor plasma flow. The reality was unignorable. The enemy across the wire was not only competent, but superior in many ways. The impact of Christmas 1943 still lingered as well. American organizations had sent 500,000 packages to German POWs: chocolate, soap, coffee, cigarettes. Boy Scouts delivered handmade cards. Churches sang German carols. Families whose sons were dying in Europe baked cakes for the captives of those same sons' enemies. For German nurses steeped in propaganda that painted Americans as weak, selfish, and materialistic, the contradiction was unbearable. Charity from enemies cut deeper than any punishment. It all converged into a slow, grinding realization. Ideology collapses under evidence. Every sterilizer cycle, every plasma transfusion, every black nurse issuing a correction was proof that could not be dismissed. The true collapse came when liberation footage of concentration camps was shown to German POW medical personnel in spring 1945. Denial crumbled as evidence mounted. Photographs, testimonies, letters from home. They had served a system that perverted medicine into murder. In the American wards, they were witnessing the opposite: medicine as universal compassion. The Americans handled it not with vengeance, but with pedagogy. They emphasized that medicine itself was not guilty, but that its corruption under ideology had turned it into a weapon. They held courses on medical ethics, using case studies that contrasted racial doctrine with scientific healing. Lieutenant Colonel Dorothy Whitman at Camp Opelika arranged for German nurses to shadow American counterparts, documenting everything: patient advocacy, ethical record-keeping, informed consent. The message was clear: technical skill without ethical practice was insufficient. For the German nurses, the psychological toll was immense. They had been taught that obedience was virtue, that ideology was truth, and that medicine was a tool for racial cleansing. In the American hospitals, they saw autonomy as virtue, science as truth, and medicine as universal. By 1945, they could no longer return to their former beliefs intact. The cracks had widened into permanent fractures. And though many did not yet realize it, these lessons would become the foundation for post-war German medicine. Inside the American POW hospitals, the transformation was not loud. It was in the hiss of an autoclave, the hum of a suction machine, the calm authority of a nurse correcting a doctor, the quiet professionalism of an African-American woman whose very presence disproved years of indoctrination. Hospitals Without Borders had done what no battlefield could. They had converted the enemy, not by argument, not by force, but by proof written in survival rates and healed wounds. By the spring of 1945, the war that had begun with banners and parades ended with ruins and revelations. For German nurses held in American POW hospitals, captivity had not been the degradation they had feared. It had been something stranger, a curriculum. And as the Reich collapsed, their education became an inheritance they would carry back to a shattered nation. The breaking point for many came not with penicillin or plasma, but with images. Liberation footage from concentration camps was shown to medical personnel in captivity. At first, denials rose like reflex, propaganda, exaggeration, staged theatre. But the evidence mounted. Photographs, eyewitness testimony, even letters smuggled from Germany that confirmed what they had refused to believe. Piles of emaciated bodies, children treated as experiments, patients murdered under the banner of racial hygiene. For nurses who had trained under the NS-Schwesternschaft, the Nazi sisterhood, the shock was existential. They had been taught that medicine served the Volk, that the weak were a burden to be culled. Now they faced the reality that medicine had been twisted into murder. The ideology that had shaped their professional identities crumbled under the weight of undeniable truth. The Americans did not exploit the moment with jeers. Instead, they turned it into structured pedagogy. Denazification programs for medical staff became mandatory. Courses in medical ethics were delivered, using case studies that contrasted Nazi racial practices with American clinical approaches. Where German texts had celebrated strength through elimination, American instructors presented principles of patient rights, informed consent, and scientific objectivity. At Camp Opelika, Lieutenant Colonel Dorothy Whitman organized observational rotations for German nurses. They shadowed American counterparts, learning everything from document adaptation to patient advocacy. Whitman's message was simple. Technical skill without ethics was not enough. The role of a nurse was not obedience to ideology, but responsibility to life itself. The curriculum included practical subjects for a Germany about to collapse: epidemic control, water purification, vaccination strategies, malnutrition treatment. Nurses were drilled in public health as much as in clinical medicine, preparing them to re-enter a homeland where hospitals had been bombed into rubble and epidemics loomed. One officer, Colonel Richard Stevens, framed it directly. "You are returning to massive medical needs. This training is our investment in a democratic Germany." His words were not just lecture, but strategy, rebuilding through knowledge rather than conquest. By the time repatriation began in 1945 and 1946, the German nurses carried certificates documenting their American training, credentials that would prove invaluable in the wreckage of post-war Europe. The return. When the nurses returned, they found a homeland nearly unrecognizable. Between 60% and 70% of German hospitals were destroyed. Supplies were non-existent. Trains carried not patients but refugees. Malnutrition stalked cities, and epidemics of typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis threatened to spread unchecked. Into this void stepped women who had been prisoners, but who returned with notebooks, knowledge, and something harder to measure: a new philosophy. Former POWs began establishing nursing schools that rejected the authoritarian model of Nazi training. Instead, they emphasized patient advocacy, clinical reasoning, and continuous education. Instructors taught that a nurse's duty was to question, to record, to protect, not simply to obey. Blood banking systems were established in German hospitals, directly copied from American models. Antibiotics, when available through Allied occupation forces, were implemented systematically rather than experimentally. Sterilization procedures shifted from boiling pots to autoclaves once equipment became available again, because returning nurses insisted that anything less was negligence. The ripple effects multiplied. A single nurse trained in America could influence dozens of colleagues. A reorganized hospital could treat thousands. By the late 1940s, German pharmaceutical companies adopted quality standards that mirrored those witnessed in American POW hospitals. The numbers, the scale of the transformation is visible in the statistics. Total German POWs held in the US, over 370,000. Medical facilities staffed with German personnel, more than 200. Documented hours of medical education delivered to POWs, over 100,000. nursing schools established by former POW nurses after repatriation, at least 15. Hospitals reorganized on American models within the U.S. occupation zone, dozens directly traceable to returnees. Each number hides lives reshaped. Every former POW nurse who returned carried a multiplier effect, teaching colleagues, training students, and embedding practices that became permanent. The ethical conversion. For many nurses, the conversion was not just professional but moral. They had entered captivity believing in German superiority and the legitimacy of racial medicine. They left with the understanding that science and compassion, not ideology, defined medical excellence. In 1995, long after the guns fell silent, a group of surviving nurses who had been POWs in the US drafted a collective statement. It read, "We served the Nazi regime and became American prisoners. We witnessed that medicine corrupted by ideology becomes death's instrument, while medicine based on science and compassion serves life. Americans showed us abundance beyond imagination: medications, technology, resources. More importantly, they demonstrated medicine without hatred. They treated enemies as patients deserving equal care. We returned carrying more than medical knowledge. We brought understanding that healing transcends nationality and ideology. It was a testimony not just to survival, but to transformation." Contradictions and ironies. The nurses carried home not only admiration, but also contradictions. They had seen American abundance side by side with American segregation. They had worked under African-American nurses whose professionalism disproved every lie of Nazi racial propaganda, even while the US Army relegated those same women to treating prisoners rather than its own white soldiers. The irony was not lost on them. Yet even flawed American systems had produced outcomes superior to the Reich's. Even prejudice restrained by law produced more healing than ideology, unrestrained by conscience. By the 1950s, the imprint of American captivity was visible across German medicine. Nursing schools incorporated case-based reasoning and patient advocacy. Hospitals maintained blood banks as standard practice. Pharmaceutical companies emphasized expiration dates and quality control. Most of all, the ethos had shifted. Nursing was no longer defined solely as obedience. It was defined as professional responsibility. The women who had once stepped into daylight at Cherbourg with their hands raised returned to Germany with notebooks full of American methods. They taught new generations that sterilization required proof, that antibiotics were not optional, and that compassion could not be rationed. They had entered captivity as enemies. They left as witnesses. The testament, the transformation of German nurses in American captivity, stands as one of World War II's quietest but most effective ideological conversions. Guns and bombs could not have persuaded them. Interrogations and propaganda would not have sufficed. What changed them was proof delivered daily, lives saved, wounds healed, systems that worked. The 9 nurses who stepped from Cherbourg's Cave Hospital in July 1944 symbolized thousands who would undergo this same revelation. They had entered captivity believing in the superiority of their system. They left knowing that medical excellence derived not from ideology, but from science, logistics, and compassion. That lesson reshaped German medicine for generations. It remains a testament that healing, practiced without discrimination, carries not only the power to save bodies, but also to transform minds. In the end, the Americans had won more than a war. They had demonstrated that medicine without borders is stronger than medicine chained to ideology.